Okay, we have pressed go and we have participants loading as we speak. So what I'm going to do to kick things off, everybody, is or you all get yourself settled, and while we have other participants join on, is do a quick little introduction. My name is Peter Clark from O'Brien Real Estate and one of the directors of both offices, but also working with the corporate team. And I'm joined by a number of guests here today. We have Natalie, Jay, and Lucy. I'm going to introduce them individually shortly, but welcome on behalf of O'Brien Real Estate. We are enjoying running these live webinar series as a way of bringing some informative information to you, but helping try and keep both not just our rental providers and also our renters, but the larger investment community abreast of what is going on in what has been an ever-changing set of circumstances for the Victorian landscape, certainly when it comes to property management and investing. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on the changes to the application process. So as of today, if you weren't aware, or as of tonight, moving forward, we are all bound by a mandatory set of questions on application forms. And what we'd like to do tonight through our panelists is run through some of the facts as we see them, what some of those changes are, how it affects you as investors, and then possibly have a look at how we're going to handle those changes in the real world. So welcome aboard. It looks like we have a huge group gathering. So I'm going to hand over quickly to introduce herself to the one and only Natalie Cronin. Now, you may notice, for those with attention to detail, that we had advertised Kylie Neal joining us today. I'm actually hoping that Kylie will actually get to see this, but Kylie has been otherwise engaged, unfortunately, today. But no, not disappointed to have Natalie sitting in the room with us. Natalie, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. For those of you who aren't familiar, my name's Natalie Cronin, as Peter said. I've been in the real estate industry, specifically actually property management, for 18 or so years, many more years than I would like to admit, but recently taken up a position at the REIV in the continuing professional development sector there. So my job is to, as Peter said, ensure that we're improving the skills of the practitioners of real estate, not just in property management, but across the board. And I'm delighted to be able to join you tonight to give you some more information about those changes.
Thank you. Now, I have just had a little chat pop up saying there is some interference. I've just messaged a couple of other people I know are on board. Brigida, it may be at your end because I haven't had any other comments just yet, but I will keep you posted. And if there's an issue there, we'll try and sort it out as we go. So in the meantime, while I make sure that is not too much of an issue, I'd like to hand over to Jay and Lucy. Jay, would you like to introduce yourself and your role within the O'Brien network?
Thanks, Peter. I have been with O'Brien's for over 6 years, been in property management for over 10 years and leading a great team here at O'Brien's. Yeah, and over to you, Lucy.
I'm Lucy Olivia. I am head of rentals and our office manager in one of our offices down here. I've been in the industry for over 16 years and with Obrien Real Estate for nearly 8. Looking forward to an exciting, interesting webinar.
Yeah, another change.
Another change. Well, welcome, girls. Thank you so much for being a part of tonight. So, to everybody on board, just want to run you through what we're going to do. Shortly, I'm going to hand over to Natalie to run you through. So, Natalie's role at the REIV has been a great support to us, and we're going to get Natalie to run through a lot of the changes in a presentation style for you. We have opened up the chat room. Jay and Lucy may disappear on their screens for a little bit, but they will be monitoring those questions. So if you do have questions, please type them into the chat room. There is a Q&A section as well, but type them into the chat room. Jay and Lucy will be making sure that we record each of those questions. And once Natalie's finished, we'll come back and we'll answer them all at the end. So rather than trying to chop and change, I'll let Natalie get right through her presentation, and then we'll bring Jay and Lucy back on to answer as many questions as we can. So Jay, Lucy, I'm going to leave you to that, and I'm going to hand over to Natalie. But maybe just importantly, before we do, Natalie, just a little disclaimer. We are obviously representing the O'Brien network here, and obviously Natalie is representing herself from the REIV. Most of what we're going to talk about tonight is factual, and they're very clear very clear standards or changes that are going to be pretty simple to get through. That being said, the real world application of how they are handled can vary office to office. So if you're not a member of the O'Brien network, please make sure you check in with your group. But also, even within the O'Brien network, every office can have some little differences between office to office. So bear that in mind. And Natalie, I'm going to hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. So as per Peter's disclosure or disclaimer, I also do have one of my own. Obviously, my role here tonight is to give you a bit of a guided walk through the changes, and we will do so as best as possible answering questions. But just keep in mind that whilst we're providing the most current and practical information, this is just purely a roadmap for your PM's practice or agency's practice, and it shouldn't be treated as a substitute for any independent advice from your specific property manager, specifically with more complex issues. So moving into what the changes are. So as Peter alluded, we've had some big changes come into effect today, which we're going to discuss with you. The first being, and the most important to yourselves as rental providers, is that now applicants have to use a specialised form, a form called 3A, which has been provided by Consumer Affairs, to complete their application request. So previously, in case you were unaware, there was no mandate around the questions, the information that you could request from any applicant. But now there is a form that must be utilised by all agents throughout Victoria. The purpose of the introduction of this legislation was really to reduce any favourability for any particular applicant and make sure that all parties are viewed from an equal standing. You will see as we go into what that looks like that there are going to be some frustration points. There are going to be some things that we continue to navigate through, but that's where your property manager at O'Brien should be able to assist. Now, I can see some questions coming through. Is there sound okay? Peter, if you can just give me a thumbs up. Perfect. Okay, so
Natalie, sorry, there are a couple of people experiencing some sound issues, but it will appear to be localized. I've got a few coming back saying it is perfectly fine. So sorry, Gemma, check on your end, but it would appear that most is happening okay.
Okay, not a problem at all. So some of the prohibited questions that we previously could ask for but can't anymore. So we used to be able to ask for detailed bank statements, which indicated and described every single transaction that had occurred in that statement. Unfortunately, now we can only ask for a proof of balance, and that purely is, as it suggests, a letter from the banking institution that says, as at X date, this account has X amount of funds available. You'll no longer be able to see where the funds are being utilised. We can no longer ask for bond claim history. So has the renter had any experience at VCAT, good, bad, or otherwise? And that leads into the next, which is if they've ever had a dispute at VCAT. So keep in mind, these are things that we cannot ask for on the application form. One that becomes less relevant to you is data destruction. So this is another one of the changes that's come into effect. So previously, we were able to hold on to applications for all of eternity. But obviously with the security things that we've experienced, with Optus, etc., we now must destroy or de-identify applications within 30 days of the property being leased if you were unsuccessful. For successful renters, then we can retain the data during that tenancy, but it must be de-identified or destroyed within 3 years after they vacate. I guess the questions may be, how does this affect you as a landlord? Well, you need to be aware that if you are presented with applications for your property and you initially turn them down, waiting and hoping that maybe something better comes along, and maybe unfortunately you don't receive that something better, you may then find that your applicant has to delay their application process because they have to refill it out if the agent has destroyed it, being outside of that 30-day period.
So Natalie, this has been a big talking point with a lot of property managers because it's pretty common that a tenant may apply, and especially in a high demand market, they may not get their first applicant and then they want to reapply. The reality is now the tech does allow most of the tech platforms, I won't say all, but most of the tech platforms that property managers are using, they're once they've filled one of those out, most of their information will regenerate, but they will have to reapply each time for either that property again or different properties.
So you can also, I guess, to that point, if you have written permission from an applicant who, in that example, Peter, is using that application to apply for multiple properties, they can advise you in writing that they don't want their application de-identified, and that would give you an additional 6 months to hold on to that and therefore not destroy it or impede their ability to apply for other properties. But yes, as you said, most of that is going to be managed by a third-party platform by many agents. There's very few who are going to have paper application forms.
Yeah, and probably on this page, the most fearful one that we know our rental providers are going to be concerned about is the bond claim history and whether there's been a dispute in VCAT. And there is good and bad here, right? The reality is it can no longer show us a history of form, maybe by a poor renter in the past. But also the reality is we do know, and we're very aware that sometimes rental providers have maybe wrongfully tried to claim bonds for things that weren't the renter's issue in the first place.
That's correct. So if there are issues where a renter has been to VCAT and they have had a case awarded against them, there are some certain factors, such as if they owe more than 1 month's rent, where they can be listed on, I guess, for want of a better word, the tenant blacklist, and that would be picked up if we're, doing additional checks, which I'll talk about in a moment. So it is really important as agents that if we are going down that path, that we do take those next steps so that we all help identify these scenarios. So I guess moving on to what does Form 3A look like? Now, again, it may not look exactly like this because third-party providers can utilise their own branding, etc., but it must include this information. So the premises that they're applying for, the address, so the property, your property address of your rental, their name, the agency name, my apologies, and the agency details that they're applying through. So in this case, it would be Obrien. The number of occupants. So this is something that we have raised with Consumer Affairs because as you can see there, you can list, say, 3 occupants. Maybe there's a mother, father, and a child, but previously, you were able to list the name of any other occupants so that on a third-party platform, you could merge and link these details. I will talk to that in a little bit, but there is a workaround with regards to that. Personal details of the applicant, so full name, date of birth, current address, postcode, phone, and email. Employment details. So this is a good one to look at. So we've got current or most recent employer, the employment address, net weekly income, and if not currently employed, date on which most recent employment ended. So it doesn't actually say here what's the nature of the employment. Is it full-time, part-time, casual, etc.? Nor does it have a phone number as well for the employer. Again, this is something that we've raised with Consumer Affairs to get a bit more clarity around. They've pointed us to look at the identification documents, which is point 6 on this application form, to gain further information about the employer. So with point 6, it's the financial information, and this would be completed by your agent, so by Obrien, prior to any applicant applying, because this would need to be a standard document throughout the offices. What it requests is that we can ask for 2 payslips from the current or recent employer, a bank balance statement, or a Centrelink statement or letter. So we can ask for 2 of those. Now, again, there have been questions raised as to what if this person is self-employed? It doesn't allow us to ask for, say, a tax return or a tax accountant's details, etc. That's not specified in those documents. If you have a situation as a renter where you aren't able to meet the requirements of Section 6, you can provide other financial documents to satisfy that request. So that may fall into that other category. However, as a standard, Obrien would need to decide what they're going to request from their renters. Now, keep in mind, it doesn't say concurrent payslips, it just says current. So this is where agents are going to have to be very mindful with regards to their reference checking to make sure that they are, casting a very thorough eye over things, not just a tick and flick mentality. And I'm not suggesting that Obrien do that, but I have seen other agents. Okay, so moving on to the balance of the application form. So verification of identity. We actually now have a list of documents here that we can ask for. And again, we have 2 of each. So, sorry, 2. I'm confusing myself here. So we can ask for a driver's license, proof of age, Medicare, insurance, Australian passport, birth certificate, a certificate of citizenship, tertiary student cards, Centrelink, Department of Veteran Affairs, utility bill, and letter from the government department. Now, again, Obrien would need to note in boxes A and B what they are satisfied to receive as the verification of identity. And there is no requirement where previously as an agent practicing best practice, you would ask for 100 points of ID, which would obviously include a photo ID along with something else. There is no requirement set out in this application or in the legislation to say that that is a requirement. Now, you can request it as an agency by saying that you want a driver's license and a birth certificate, or a passport and a birth certificate, or whatever it is you choose. However, again, if the applicant does not have the ability to submit, for example, a driver's license because they're not from Australia, then they are able to submit one of the other documents. This is, again, something to keep in mind, that whilst your agent is going to be as thorough as possible, there are restrictions around what they can continue to ask for.
Yeah, so Natalie, to confirm that, if I understand this correct and listening to you now, we can suggest which mode of identification we want as an agency. But if an applicant simply fills this out and provides those other 2 things, in theory, we can't push them for anything further beyond that.
Correct. So once you've got your 2 forms off that list of documents, yes, whether they are the ones you've requested or not, yes, that you can't then ask. They can, they have the ability to offer other information outside of this application, but we can't be seen to have requested anything further.
Yeah.
Correct. So moving on to point 8, we've got the rental or residential history. Quite straightforward there with regards to the property address, period of residence at the property, and the agent name. However, you might see that there is a glaringly obvious missing rental amount. So they're no longer required here to list what they are or were currently paying in rent, which is normally something that would be used to assess their affordability for your property. This is where the legislation and the intent of that comes into play, because the government don't want to disadvantage anyone because of their supposed or interpreted affordability. Ridiculous, I know. I can hear all the sighs remotely, but unfortunately we are bound by this. Again, if you're having a conversation with the renter and they offer that information, then that's fantastic, but we can't ask them for it, nor can we ask for it on this application form. So it does ask for their current and previous rental history if they do have one. References, again, straightforward, but it does say there that they are personal references. Previously, I know on applications at companies I've worked for, we've had the option of both professional references and also for your personal references. Now, this is where I really think, actually, you know what, I'm going to hold that comment because I've got some more information first and then we'll cover it off. But terms of rental agreement, that's pretty straightforward. That's what are they looking for with securing your property, a 12-month, a 24-month, etc., and their preferred move-in date. Now, the next part of this is the tenancy database. So now that we're limited on the information that we can obtain, we really need to make sure that we're utilising everything that is available to us. I'm not sure, O'Brien, do you guys, I'm not sure if it's throughout all your offices, but Peter, do you use some form of database checking?
NTD is a very common one,
NTD.
and there are a number of different groups that individual offices do subscribe to, but that seems to be one of the most popular and common.
Perfect. So what that is, for those that don't know, is we'll put all of the information into this database and it will come up and say if there's been any court judgments, any illegal activity, criminal records. It can also be positive things like management or directorship of a company as well. So it's not all negative. But if O'Brien or the office you're dealing with is deciding to do one of these checks, it does need to be disclosed to the renter in advance. So again, this portion of the application will be filled out prior to the renter completing it. So we need to disclose what database we're utilising. So as Peter said, NTD, but there are other companies as well. And if we actually do one of these checks, and just so you know, they do have an associated cost, they're not free. But if we do one of those checks and it does come up with information, then we are actually required to disclose that information to the renters. If we don't disclose that information, then we're actually in breach of the regulations, and that is quite a hefty penalty. It's 60 penalty units, but that is probably more for your agent to discuss through with you as opposed to me, because it's not effective. It's not directly going to affect you. So just covering off some more provisions or areas of change on the applications. We used to be able to ask for pet information. Does the applicant have a pet? That's no longer going to be something that we can ask for. Again, I've talked about the terms of employment. That's no longer covered. No requirement for 100 points of ID, current or previous rental amount, the length of the previous or current tenancies as well, additional renters. So going back to that was if you're applying as a mum and dad, how can you identify that? Now, we got confirmation today that third-party platforms that likely O'Brien's are using are able to include a question on the application that says, are you applying with other people? And if so, include their name and I think their email address, because that's not going to advantage or disadvantage anyone by purely connecting those applications together. Employment reference, as we said, and phone numbers, that's no longer there, and emergency contact information. Now, previously, we would request that information in case, we were not able to get in contact with the renter for whatever reason. We are able to request that, but not on the application form. So O'Brien may decide to include that as part of their application approval process, but that's completely up to them as to how that's managed. Now, as we mentioned before, just to cover off so we're all very clear, no longer able to ask for an infinite amount of pay slips and bank statements, and no longer are we allowed to ask for an infinite number of ID documents. As I mentioned before, so if you are self-employed, you can ask for if the renter is self-employed, you can ask them to provide additional information outside of those prerequisites that are filled on the application form. So what does this mean? So in a landscape where we're now provided limited information, we really need to I've put move away, but what I really mean to say is work in conjunction with your third-party platforms. So that would be the systems that O'Brien utilised to obtain their application forms. Some companies and some agents, have a bit of a tick and flick mindset. They get the application. Some of it may be auto-checked by AI. fantastic, but I think we need to also go back to the days of picking up the phone and asking questions, just delving that little bit further. We need to think outside of the box. So again, pick up the phone. You can ask exactly the same questions that are outlined on the application, but you can gauge tone. So you could say, did they rent this property? Yes. You automatically know that there's something going on there, as opposed to just seeing yes on an email response or reference. Utilizing Google searches, both on the companies and the individuals, as part of your embedded application processing. Not sure if that's something that you guys currently do, but it is something that I have seen done and is very valuable. Looking up Facebook profiles, that is definitely a bit of a look into the life of said applicant. Same with Instagram as well. Also good to get a hold of the digital footprint. So when you're looking up employment references, look up their digital footprint. Are they actually a company? Do they have an ABN? Do they have a digital presence, or is it just a little company that Joe Blow made up in the backyard so that he can fill out his application form? We need to be really diligent with our references. If they are providing the information, you can then call them and ask them if they're a personal or work reference. But either way, again, not just asking, how do you know them? Was their house maintained well? We probably need to delve a little bit deeper. Ensure, and we've talked about it just before, but one of the requested ID forms is photo ID. And again, if you're going to request one of those forms of ID as a driver's license, make sure you get in the front and the back. These things are just going to help you correlate the information that is provided by your renters or applicants. Now, I think it's really important to note that tenants are very much educated on the do's and the don'ts now. It is very easy for them to do a Google search, get in contact with renters union, etc., and get the information that they need. They actually would get a copy of the tenant information that goes along with the application. This is part B on the screen at the moment, that details what they can and can't provide, what we can and can't ask for. So I think it's really, really important that we are aware of this information. Now, if we ask for information outside of this, I mentioned before that there are hefty fines. The fines are 60 penalty units. So we'd be in breach of Section 30AC of the Act if we ask for information outside of this form. Now, as at today, the penalty unit is $203.51, which means that a fine of 60 units is $12,201 and some cents. So it's really, really important that whilst we know that there are restrictions, we work with the agent and your property managers to get as much information as possible, and that we, as I said before, move away from that kind of tick and flick. Now, that's a lot of information in a very short period, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, but I have come to that point where we've covered everything off, I hope clearly enough. Peter, over to you and the team.
Yeah, Natalie, well done. Look, it's a lot of information to get through quickly. To everybody online, and we've got a huge participation audience today, so thank you very much for joining. Let me just start by saying this. One, if we can't cover everything tonight, we have been collating your questions both in the Q&A and in the chat room. We have your details through the registration, which is why we've asked you to register. We will send you out both a recording of this as well as answers to those questions to the best of our ability. But also too, before I hand over to the girls, just be aware that not all of these will have answers to them just yet. And secondly, what we're doing tonight is educating you on the decisions that have been put down by our governance, not necessarily by our choice, right? So just be aware and mindful that your property managers are handling this as best they can, not because this is the way they want to see things done, but because this is our governance that is dictating how it is. So I'm going to ask Jay and Lucy to take themselves off mute, and I'm going to get our property managers to take over a little bit of the floor and have a look through the questions. And Jay, Lucy, if I can hand over to you and run through some of the questions in our Q&A.
Yeah, we've received like a lot of questions. Some that Luce and I actually have the same questions for you as well, Natalie. So we might start with those ones if that's okay. You've mentioned obviously we can get employment details and kind of look through their pay slips and what they provide us as well. If their employment details are actually on their pay slips, are we allowed to call for an employment check?
So that's a really good question. And I don't want at all anyone to think that I'm dodging the questions. Obviously, I can only answer what we know. And a lot of what we've been advised is very grey. The way that I would frame this for you is if you wish to do that, you obviously open yourself up to some element of risk because you're going outside of what the requirements are. And effectively, the employer would be disclosing information to you that could put that applicant in a better position than applicant B. So if I were to be black and white with you, the answer would be no, but there's no real, we haven't received any clarity from Consumer Affairs with regards to this, if I'm honest with you.
One of the questions from one of our owners was how were rental managers going to navigate this issue? Obviously, we're still trying to get the answers so we can actually educate our owners correctly and do the right thing by them as well as the renters that are applying. Luce and I had a bit of a chat before and we were saying that one thing is if we are getting presented with multiple applications, obviously the application says they can upload a minimum of 2 documents. If we have obviously applicants that are uploading like say 5 payslips over the 2, we're obviously better educated with one of the applicants over the other.
Correct. So these days, I would say majority of payslips should include some form of historical payment information, whether it has their year-to-date earnings or sometimes their lump sum, whatever their package is. And we can use tools at hand like pay calculator to try and figure out what that person would be on. Again, we have gone to CAV today with with further questions with regards to, concurrent pay slips. I know, there are some industries where you can receive a big bonus at the end of financial year. And if that's the pay slip that is provided, whereas, the everyday is significantly less, then that obviously can create issue. But it's something to be aware of. And that's why I said, try and utilize the tools at hand, such as pay calculator, such as, navigating their digital footprint, all that kind of stuff to assist. And of course, as I said, they can provide more, but we cannot ask for it.
Yep.
So when we are processing applications, there's obviously a couple of property managers in these questions as well, but when we are processing applications for clients, what is the recommendation in regards to what questions we actually ask other property managers? Obviously, we can't now ask bond information. Previously, we would get copies of rental ledgers so that we can see and make sure rental payments are on time. Copies of routine inspections were sent across and things like that to make sure that we're informing our clients the best that we can on our recommendations on renters. What are the questions that we can actually ask property managers now?
Well, effectively, you can't ask anything outside of what's on the application form. But that's where I say about the element of risk. If you want to ask the agent those questions, then you open yourself up to some element of risk if that were to get back to the applicant and say that person then was unsuccessful, and they thought that they were unsuccessful because you had received an unfavorable reference for them. That's where that risk element comes in.
Right, yes. But as a property manager as well, if we get a call from a reference, like you said, you can catch a tone of a voice when someone asks about a client and things. What information can we give? Like if a property manager openly says information about this renter, are they opening themselves up for a fine from Consumer Affairs, even though
That's
they're
very
giving it?
Very good question. It hasn't been tested yet, so I'm not really 100% sure or confident to give you a straight answer on that. But it's something that we can definitely raise with them. And that's something that I want to make very clear. As the REIV, we do have direct contact with Consumer Affairs. So if there are things that are raised this evening, and keeping in mind this legislation's only come into effect today, that we don't have answers for, and as Peter said, it's highly likely there'll be more than just this one, we can take it back to Consumer Affairs and ask them for clarity. Now, keep in mind, Consumer Affairs aren't the governing body in the sense that they didn't write the legislation. They can only interpret the legislation. So that's why the information that they do give us or give everyone can be somewhat grey.
Another question that we had was obviously around pets at the property, which we thought this would be a big topic. So pets, we're obviously not allowed to ask for pets on the application. So the step for us is we believe that then the renter must provide a pet request after they've been approved. Now,
Correct, yes.
If they don't, so my question is, how do the renters know to then provide a rent request? Is that just something that obviously property managers will have to be putting in their welcome emails? If we do have a pet, please submit a pet request form and we can then pass on?
Correct. So the approval would need to happen first, and then as some form of a follow-up email to them prior to signing a lease agreement. So a step in between is when you'd be requesting a copy of that pet form.
Yep. Another question, Lise?
Someone has asked here, so you're advising we're okay to check someone's social media accounts?
Yeah, I mean, there's free will to use your mobile and look up someone. I mean, a lot of profiles are locked these days. I can tell you, though, that I have been saved many a time by doing a quick Google check of somebody.
Yes, I agree.
I think we've all done it. One of the other questions was obviously, I know from our office we require people over the age of 18 to be submitting an application per adult. Now, one of the questions was, if we can't ask for their age, how do we know how many occupants are going to be there? So I know from a property manager's perspective, when we're checking applications, it's going to come down to affordability as well. But is there, in the form, it actually says we may request, not that we must request?
Correct. I was just about to say it says the word may request. Look, I would still be pushing that I guess this is where your communication to the applicants prior to them completing the application form is probably really important. So when you're meeting them at the inspections, you know, everyone over the age of, we'd request that everyone over the age of 18 fill out this form. That's where that is really going to come into play, because yes, we can't hard arm them or strong arm them, to fill out a form. It's only that they may be requested.
And I suppose this is where Lucy and I have both spoken to our teams about how we are going to navigate this as well. So going back to that question, it's also coming down to our open homes, taking as much information, talking to our clients without obviously asking the prohibited questions, but actually getting a feel for who they are as renters and who they are as people. So we can actually also then provide a bit of a character reference for our owners as well, as long as the application as well, and probably guiding our renters that obviously the more information without stepping outside the lines is going to be in their best interest as well.
Correct. And that's where you're really going to rely on your gut feel that PMs definitely have. And yes, you're correct. We probably need to do some work in the emotional intelligence space so that we can be very comfortable with asking those questions or gauging, you know, body language, etc. But you're correct. You're 100% correct. We need to be relying on that specifically.
We have a bunch of questions here, but we might be running out of time, Pete. We might follow this up after. Do you want to?
Yeah, look, Lucy, I was just going to, conscious of time, it's 10 past 6. Maybe if there's any one last final question you want to throw to Natalie while we've got her, but there are a few other questions that we know are commonly asked. One thing I will say is we can clearly see there's a bit of tone in some of the questions and there's some frustration, right? We feel it. We are feeling the exact same way. We understand your frustration. Our job ultimately is to help you safeguard your property and to manage it to the best of our ability. I do think, and the girls, the team have just touched on it, I do think that you are going to rely more and more on the experience of your property manager, the handling of open for inspections and private inspections, and getting to know people as they are walking through the door, looking for gaps in both applications, but also commentary made by potential renters, sorry. And so making sure you are choosing, but also talking with your property manager in a far more in-depth way is going to be really important. But ultimately, it will, and I think it will evolve because some of this actually disadvantages good renters as well. Yeah, and I think we'll have some renters tuning in tonight, and they're more than welcome. It's a really transparent piece. We want to have great relationships with our renters. And sadly, I think some of this will actually work in a negative to some of our really strong renters that might have otherwise had great applications. That's going to be harder to differentiate. So I think it could be an evolving piece as we progress and the CAV and governance get feedback onto the real life application of this. But Lewis or Jay, is there maybe one last question that you felt was important to throw to Natalie while we have a
I think one of our owners has asked, obviously following up from payslips without a secondary check with banks facing the same issue. How can this be navigated with all the fraud, AI, and everything that is out there as well? And I don't think this is a question you can answer at the time, Natalie, but I think Luce and I kind of chat about it. And it's something that we're going to have to get a lot of training on with our team and being able to pick up the differences between what a payslip is and what to look for in terms of fraud as well. And we're not obviously in that field, but we will obviously kind of dive into that a little bit more.
I can talk to that very quickly, again, conscious of time, but we did actually raise a point with Consumer Affairs today, specifically because we are aware that there are platforms that renters can go on and produce fraudulent documentation. And we have posed the question, no responses yet, as to how we can manage that. So this is going to be a work in progress, as are a lot of these things. And I think, as Peter said, it is disadvantageous to some renters. For example, if you've got people who have just recently moved to Australia and they only have the ability to pay rent up front, or their mum and dad pay the rent for them, but the capacity to pay is there, they may not meet the other requirements of the application, and therefore it could look disadvantaging to them. But again, while I'd love to give you all of the answers today, we'll continue to be in contact with O'Brien's. I'm sure there'll be questions that we will be filtered through after the session today. And, we can definitely arrange another chat when, we have a bit more clarity on the matter.
Terrific. Natalie, thank you so much. Everyone, we're going to call that an end tonight. There are a few other questions. Just so you're aware, there's a couple of questions in relation to some of the other changes that have also come into effect. We've chosen tonight to stick to the application forms, but we will see if you are part of the Obrien group. We'll make sure those questions get answered for you as well. We will share both the questions that have been asked and the answers to those with everyone who has been online and registered. And any other questions that we think are really relevant to Natalie, we're going to pose to her and the REIV, get the answers as best we can and circulate those to all our rental providers and investors into the future. But thank you so much for joining, Lucy and Jay. Thank you so much for your expertise.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Natalie, once again, thank you to yourself and the REIV for doing an outstanding job in all these changes and helping us navigate through these changes.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for having me.
Much appreciated. Good evening, guys, and we will be in touch with you all very soon.
Thank you.